Lecture 15, Ngogo Chimpanzees, Uganda Tactics of Numbers. Dawn at Ngogo starts noisy and then gets edited. Greenbulls, barbets, hornbills all announce that the forest is still there, and then a line of male chimpanzees walks the sound out of the understory one patch at a time. On a ridge in central Kibale, somewhere around 0° 30' north and 30° 20' east, a tall male takes the spine where the wind carries other people's secrets. Two heavier males drift 10 or 15 meters downslope so trunks turn into shields instead of obstacles. A compact veteran at the front quietly pulls the group's speed down to a human uncomfortable ½ meter per second. Gaps between bodies settle around 8 to 12 meters. Nobody speaks, because speaking is the whole point of the exercise. Silence is the only safe broadcast. When field teams first started writing this down in the mid-1990s, they thought they were watching a slow walk. Only when you log who stands where, how often, and with what outcome do you realize you're watching a moving equation, a traveling inequality sign that says attack if, and only if, our side outnumbers theirs by a margin that makes counter-injury improbable. The project that turned that equation into something you can print in a journal started in 1995, when John Maitani from the University of Michigan and David Watts from Yale pitched camp at Ngogo. The forest had been a national park on paper since 1993, but it was still full of old logging roads, hunters' paths, and chimpanzees who wanted nothing to do with primatologists. Local assistants from nearby villages spent months inching the observation distance down, following at the edge of flight, freezing whenever a male side-eyed them, backing off if an ear flick said, too much. No provisioning, no baiting, no gifts, just habituation by boredom. Within weeks, they had already seen a red colobus monkey ripped out of the canopy and its meat split among males who begged with fingers outstretched and soft whimpers instead of fighting. Within a few years, they had daily follows, enough to see that the patrols and the hunts used the same choreography in different theaters. The early records were literal notebooks: who was in the party, compass bearings every 10 minutes, slope categories, ridge, mid, valley, plus outcomes, no contact, vocal standoff, chase, rare kill. The map under all of this is physical. Kibale National Park is about 776 square kilometers of mid-altitude rainforest in western Uganda, but the Ngogo community uses only a fragment, roughly 30 square kilometers before things begin to get interesting. That slice is richer than it has any right to be. Giant figs of one species, Ficus mucuso, that barely show up at the better-known Kanyawara site 20 kilometers away grow here in profusion, dropping fruit in such lavish, staggered crops that the hungry season is more of a diet week. Fruit phenology data from the 2000s show that while Kanyawara chimpanzees face deep troughs in fruit availability, Ngogo's curve barely dips. The forest is basically a continuous buffet with occasional slow periods rather than real crashes. That ecological subsidy buys bodies. By 2011, censuses counted 166 chimpanzees in the Ngogo community, 32 adult males, about 50 adult females, the rest juveniles and infants. Typical communities, like Kanyawara's, hover near 50 to 60 individuals with maybe 8 adult males. Ngogo effectively runs 3 times the chimp biomass in the same park. You can't understand the behavior without that denominator. Numbers are both cause and amplifier. The prey in this system are not abstractions either. Red colobus monkeys, Pileocolobus tephroseals, move in groups of 20 or more through the canopy like a loose curtain, slow, cautious leapers with poor single-jump performance compared to the blue monkeys that share their trees. At Ngogo their densities are unusually high, which is not a comforting fact if you are a red colobus, because your predators are practicing. Long-term tallies from the early 2000s show that more than 80% of Ngogo's colobus hunts succeed, a figure that humiliates most carnivores. In a normal chimp site, a hunt might produce a single monkey, sometimes none. At Ngogo, an average successful hunt ends with roughly 4 bodies in chimpanzee hands. On record-setting days, a 2002 April hunt, for example, the party caught 10 monkeys in under an hour, 2 adult males, 3 adult females, 5 juveniles. Over a year, the chimpanzees are estimated to remove somewhere between 6 and 12% of the local red colobus population. For a primate hunting another primate, that is not a diet, it is a pressure. From the ground, those hunts look like chaos. Screaming monkeys in a cloud of leaves, chimps running along branches that ought to break, bodies appearing and vanishing between crowns. From a notebook, they look like rolls. The Ngogo team started using informal labels, drivers, blockers, ambushers, only after noticing that the same animals kept showing up in the same parts of the geometry. Drivers are the ones who commit first, launching the chase by charging into the troop and generating panic, forcing monkeys to flee along predictable routes. Blockers scramble ahead and sideways, arriving at likely escape paths a fraction of a second before the first desperate jump. Ambushers take up positions at narrow exits, a leaning trunk, a forked branch, the one deadfall bridge between two trees. If you overlay dozens of hunts on a map, the ambush trees recur with suspicious regularity, down to particular bark scars where chimp feet have slammed in and pivoted. The same handful of experienced males frequently occupy those positions. This is not theatre about heroism, it is muscle memory and path dependence. To turn, we think is good at this, into data, the team started to code hunts in earnest. Parties were listed by membership, each individual was assigned a role sequence for that event. Distance to prey, position relative to the main troop, and timing of entry into the chase were all logged, sometimes from multiple vantage points as observers split to cover different sides of the canopy. Back at camp, those notes turned into matrices, rows of hunts, columns for the presence or absence of particular specialists in particular roles. When you run the regressions, you get a brutal kind of clarity. Hunts with more adult males do better, that part is obvious, but hunts that include key ambushers in the right place at the right time do better still, even when you control for party size. Some small parties with only 3 or 4 males punched well above their weight when they used terrain properly. A single blocker stationed at the one viable escape route could mimic the effect of a much larger phalanx. Others, with 10 or 12 males but sloppier positioning, devolved into chases that ended with monkeys slipping away through unguarded exits. Numbers help, knowledge, deployed as formation, closes the deal. The same logic extends from meat to politics. Boundary patrols at Ngogo use a slower version of the hunt choreography with a different target. Males leave a feeding tree one by one, often in late morning when stomachs are full, and orient toward the edge of the community's range. A typical patrol party is a dozen or more adult males, sometimes 18 or 20 if fruit has been good and everyone can afford to walk instead of feed. They move in single file along ridges and creek lines, hugging cover, often going for 2 or 3 hours without serious feeding. GPS tracks collected over the 2000s show patrol paths of 4 to 5 kilometers, looping along particular sections of the border again and again. Sylvia Amsler, who made patrol energetics her thesis, quantified what this costs. Patrollers sacrifice significant feeding time and burn through calories for what is, in most cases, a day that ends with no contact, scribbled in the margin. That is a lousy deal unless the benefit accumulates over seasons and years. When contact does happen, the numbers snap into focus. Between roughly 1999 and 2009, observers documented at least 21 lethal attacks by Ngogo males on chimpanzees from neighboring communities, most of them concentrated along the northeastern boundary. 13 of those victims died. Range mapping before and after shows what that brought. Ngogo's territory expanded by about 6.4 square kilometers, a 22% increase over its previous size. That isn't an abstract percentage, it's extra hectares of fruiting canopy and nesting sites that mothers with infants can enter without hearing enemy screams. Demographic data from the same period show that Ngogo grew larger and richer in females compared to its neighbors. Females with infants were later seen feeding deep inside what had been the dead community's core range. The pattern matches the imbalance of power idea that's been floating around primate behavioral ecology since the late 1990s. Groups attack when the odds of injury are vanishingly low and the payoffs in land and future reproduction are high. Ngogo just supplied the cleanest test case. What makes this uncomfortable is how businesslike it all is. Patrol initiation is not simply, testosterone is high so everybody goes for a walk. Analyses that fold in 10 years of patrol records show that the probability of a patrol starting rises with the number of adult males present, with recent history of hearing or seeing neighbors, and with food abundance. When ficus crops peak and males travel in large parties anyway, patrol rates go up. When fruit is scarce and males are scattered in tiny foraging groups, patrols drop. Estrus females are an extra term in the equation. If several cycling females are concentrated in one part of the range, males are more reluctant to leave them unguarded for hours, and patrol probability dips. In other words, the decision to walk the border is a cost-benefit calculation tuned by social and ecological context. No individual is solving calculus, but the group behavior acts as though someone did the math on risk, reward, and opportunity costs. The most cinematic days, unsurprisingly, are the ones that documentaries like. When Netflix showed up with long lenses in 2019 to film what would become Chimp Empire, they gravitated toward the obvious high drama, males charging through lianas, monkeys dropping, camera operators swearing quietly because yet another kill happened just out of frame. One of the hunts from the long-term record that could have made the highlight reel took place in April 2002, when a party of 27 chimpanzees, 24 adult males, 3 females, encountered a large red colobus troop. Over about 4 to 5 minutes, the chimps sliced that troop into segments across several trees, capturing 10 monkeys in total. At one point, 3 adult males sat on a single trunk each holding a different screaming colobus. What looks like a massacre is also a coordination clinic. Drivers kept up just enough pressure to stop the troop regrouping. Blockers materialized around likely exits. Latecomer males learned by shadowing veterans rather than flinging themselves blindly into the canopy. When the party dropped down to the forest floor with their prizes, the even more bizarre behavior kicked in, meat sharing that looked almost polite, with beggars extending hands and possessors handing over strips of flesh without turning every bite into a brawl. Impressive as those orgies of protein are, the most unbelievable events at Ngogo aren't the days with blood, they are the days with none. Range maps tell the story most bluntly. Take one patrol route traced from a dry season morning on a narrow ridge just wide enough to park a pickup truck, flanked by steep slopes. A line of a dozen males moved along it at what the field notes called glacial speed, still but 0.4 to 0.6 meters per second once you subtract stops to listen. Halfway along the ridge is a shallow saddle where neighbor calls had been heard in previous years. On this morning, distant panthoots drifted up from the far side, a small party from the neighboring community, probably only a handful of males and some females. The Ngogo patrol slowed further. A scout peeled off in a loose S-curve through the saddle, another male dropped 10 meters downslope to hold a flank, and the rear of the file compressed so that gaps shrank to 5 or 6 meters. There were no vocalizations, no charge, no heroic stand. From the neighbor's point of view, what arrived was a growing sense of dangerous quiet in one direction and an easy retreat route in the other. They chose the retreat. Nobody died. A month later, feeding data placed Ngogo mothers with infants in trees beyond that saddle, using what had previously been avoided as risky ground. On paper, that day is logged as no contact. On the map, a border moved. If all you saw were the counts, 150 to 200 chimps, 30-odd adult males, more killed neighbors than any other site on record, it would be easy to wave away the choreography as mere crowding effects. Big groups can throw their weight around, end of explanation. The Ngogo data are rude enough to say, not so fast. When you look carefully at the successes of small versus large parties, you find that 4 male squads that choose their terrain properly can achieve kill rates, per opportunity, similar to bloated hunting parties, especially in broken canopy where monkeys have fewer safe landing options. Conversely, large parties blundering through tall, continuous canopy can come home empty-handed. On patrol, the same principle shows up. Parties of 8 or 9 males that keep tight formation along a ridge are less likely to be surprised or outflanked than parties of 12 that drift into a loose scatter through swampy valleys. In other words, the system is not insert males, get victory. It is insert males, plus remembered routes, plus learned roles, plus sensitivity to wind and topography, then maybe get victory. What was discovered at Ngogo, then, wasn't just that chimpanzees can be violent or that big groups can push smaller ones around. Both of those were known in outline from Gom and Maholi. The novelty was the resolution. When the Ngogo team converted what they saw from forest impressions into measurable patterns, roles per individual, success per formation, border change per patrol kilometer, they exposed a kind of primate playbook, how to use numbers in space and time. It is a playbook written without writing, updated in bodies instead of on paper. Young males learn it by following, by misjudging distances and getting glared at, by lunging too early and watching a monkey escape because they broke the funnel, by being quietly repositioned behind an older blocker who simply stands where the geometry demands. Every correction is an edit. Every quiet patrol that ends with no contact, but expands the repertoire of safe crossings is a new line added. The strange fact, and the reason this one community has bent so many arguments about human evolution, is that you can draw that playbook as a set of maps and tables and it behaves like something engineered. The animals aren't solving equations. The forest is doing that, and the chimps are copying the answer. The apprentices give the game away. You can watch an adult Ngogo male move through a hunting run and think you're seeing instinct, perfectly timed bursts, precise arcs through the canopy, a body that seems magnetically drawn to exactly the right branch. Then a 15-year-old tries to copy him and you see the software underneath. Adolescents at Ngogo start joining red colobus hunts in their early teens, the same age that a human kid is learning to drive and discovering that braking is not a vibe, it is physics. A novice will misjudge distance by a meter, grab a branch that flexes instead of holds, and convert a clean funnel into a slapstick explosion of monkeys flinging themselves out of danger. Field notes from the early 2000s literally scored error rates, premature charges, missed intercepts, bad landings. Over a few hunting seasons the same individuals go from chaos generators to reliable drivers and blockers. The raw material is a primate motor system that can memorize trajectories in 3 dimensions. The curriculum is the forest repeatedly punishing bad guesses with bruises and lost meat. No one explains any of this to them. They are shadowing specific older males, watching who hangs back, who sprints, where the body that always ends up with a carcass tends to stand when the first alarm call goes off. The forest itself is not a neutral background, it is the chalkboard. When Sylvia Amsler and colleagues went through more than a decade of hunting logs, they saw success jump in places where canopy broke, crowns were shallow, or deadfall trunks made low bridges between trees. Those structures constrain monkey physics. Red colobus are decent climbers but poor jumpers. A gap of 3 meters is a highway for a chimp and a problem for a monkey. Hunts in continuous, high canopy were more likely to fail. Hunts in broken canopy, with natural guardrails and bottlenecks, produced the multi-kill sprees that made Ngogo famous. You can watch a young driver literally learn to see those invisible funnels. Early in his career he sprints in straight lines, overshoots bends, and ends up clinging to some irrelevant sapling while the prey rockets past 2 trees away. 3 years later he is looping through the same patch on a shallow diagonal, nudging the monkeys toward a branch that every experienced ambusher in the community already has a mental tag on. Under the skin, that is the basal ganglia doing heavy lifting, repeated sequences being pruned and smoothed until they feel automatic. From the outside, it looks like a primate reinventing the concepts of lane and corner using only bark and gravity. The same apprenticeship runs through patrols, but with a darker curriculum and stricter grading. Adolescents are not automatically invited to border sweeps where an error can get someone killed. They start at the back of the line, tolerated but not trusted, copying a gait that has been tuned over thousands of kilometers. Walk too fast and you open gaps, walk too loud and you broadcast the file. The adults have settled on a speed that would drive a human hiker mad, less than half a meter per second along ridges, even slower near suspected borders. Young males fidget, try to overtake, or pause too long to gape at a hornbill. They get corrected without ceremony, a stare, a cuff, a refusal to wait when the novice drops behind. Over a year of follows you can see patrol participation profiles change. Some adolescents keep getting chances, others are quietly frozen out and left to perfect their social skills under figs instead. You do not want everyone on your border. You want the ones whose feet land in the right place when nothing appears to be happening. Culture here is not just moves, it is memory, specifically, social memory weaponized. The long Ngogo record on meat sharing killed the sexy idea that males hand out meat to females in exchange for copulations. The numbers simply do not line up. Females rarely get large portions, and males who are generous to them do not rack up more matings than grumpy ones. What the meat actually buys is male allies. Track who feeds whom across years and a pattern appears, certain dyads share with each other far more than chance, and those same pairs turn up side by side in fights and on patrol. Statistical work on the Male Coalition Network showed that individuals who sat at well-connected hubs, grooming many partners, sharing meat widely, showing up in multiple coalitions, were more likely to climb the dominance ladder and to father offspring in this absurdly crowded community. Even low-ranking males at Ngogo have paternity success because high-rankers can't monopolize everyone, but the ones who do unusually well are almost never socially isolated. Meat is the retainer fee that keeps competence from walking off alone. Reciprocity is not instant, it is amortized over years. A male who freeloads on hunts, skips patrols, and never parts with even a scrap of colobus finds himself without backup when the hierarchy starts to shift. If you want to see the social market in action, watch the aftermath of a big hunt, not the kill. In April 2002, a party of 27 chimps, 24 adult males and 3 females, took 10 red colobus in about 4 to 5 minutes of coordinated havoc. 2 adult males, 3 adult females, 5 juveniles. The carcass census reads like the result of a practiced culling algorithm. On the ground, though, the mood at the carcasses was weirdly calm given that more than 20 hungry primates were sitting shoulder to shoulder with bleeding meat. No continuous brawls, no hyena-style pilo-ns. Instead, beggars extended hands, whined, and were either ignored or granted strips. Chunks changed owners in trades that looked trivial until you checked the names. Hunters who had taken personal risks got large, defensible pieces. Mid-ranking males with decent patrol records got steady handouts. Chronic no-shows did a lot of watching. Videos sliced later into frame-by-frame sequences captured another asymmetry. Some males barely tried to grab anything, but positioned themselves next to important possessors, tolerating minor slights now for bigger favors later. It was less a feeding frenzy than a stock exchange made of blood. Comedy blooms in the cracks of all that accounting. Field assistants like to talk about the afternoon a subadult discovered drumming. At Ngogo, buttress roots with hollow chambers can turn a few blows into a bass announcement that carries hundreds of meters. Done correctly, drumming marks a location, rallies friends, or, from the border, hints at presence without overcommitting. This youngster found a magnificent root and went absolutely feral for 5 minutes, pounding out a proud, echoing tattoo, right on the far side of the tree from where a hunting party was trying to stay invisible. The sound carried beautifully in exactly the wrong direction, warning a troop of red colobus that promptly used the racket as a navigational beacon, swinging away through safe canopy while the would-be attackers cursed under their breath. The reprimand was not theatrical. An older male walked over, planted himself, and stared until the drummer folded. A week later on a different ridge, the same youngster chose a route that faced inward toward his own party, waited until the drivers had already committed, then drummed 3 sharp beats that glued the line for just long enough to time an ambush. The lesson had landed: noise is a tool, orientation and timing are part of the grammar. Legends accumulate around these minor disasters and rescues. Trails in the Ngogo range have human names and chimp names, and sometimes both. A narrow saddle where 3 experienced males once pulled off an improbable intercept with only a handful of bodies gets remembered as the short hook, and everyone, human and ape, seems to move a little more carefully when patrols pass through it. A creek bend where a trio learned how to perform a full border maneuver with only 3 attackers, using the slope, the water noise, and a particularly treacherous vine mat, is the sort of place field teams drag visiting students to, in the same way a physics professor drags you to see the lab where the famous experiment happened. These are not myths in the sense of supernatural stories, they are compressed case studies with proper nouns. Even the chimp names carry method. A mid-ranking male nicknamed Wilson because he kept ending up at the point of the spear in patrols became a sort of living footnote to theory papers about coalitionary killing. Garrison, an anxious West Side male whose cortisol levels spiked as the community drifted toward fission, became a walking graph of chronic stress. When those individuals age or die, the stories shift from present tense to past, and the behaviors they embodied either get reinstantiated in new bodies or fade with them. The prey are not props in this system, they are learners, too. Ngogo's chimpanzees take an estimated 6 to 12% of the local red colobus population every year, which is an obscene figure for a primate predator. Long-term monitoring of the monkeys shows declines in some heavily hunted patches and behavioral changes in others. Groups that used to forage lower and cross gaps casually now hug higher, denser canopy where a chimp can't easily sprint along branches beneath them. Alarm calls are triggered at greater distances, and troops seem to avoid certain ridges altogether during seasons when chimp patrol activity spikes. In some parts of the range, colobus group sizes have nudged upward, which may dilute individual risk during a raid. The same logic Ngogo applies in reverse. The masculine events tell you why this arms race matters. In July 2006, during a high-fruit dry season when many males could afford to travel together, Ngogo chimps killed 8 red colobus and, for good measure, a black and white colobus that blundered into the fray. 9 monkeys in one extended chase. Aerial footage would have looked like a coordinated drive by wolves or wild dogs. From the ground, it was apes making very fast decisions in a forest they knew too well. Prey demography becomes part of the moral ledger whether anyone likes it or not. Border aggression runs on the same cognitive hardware as hunting, but pointed at relatives instead of lunch. The imbalance of power story is simple to say and hard to execute. Attack only when you outnumber the opposition so heavily that your own risk is negligible. At Ngogo, lethal raids almost always involved 5 to 20 males ambushing a single victim or, at most, a tiny subset of a neighboring party. You can see the risk assessment process in both natural patrols and carefully staged experiments. When researchers played panthoot choruses from unfamiliar males at the edge of the territory, Ngogo males gathered fast and moved toward the sound in what looked, on GPS traces, like a miniature patrol. When only 1 or 2 stranger voices boomed, parties moved with obvious confidence, accelerating as they homed in. When many voices blasted at once, or when the playback was paired with other signs of a large party, fresh feces, broken vegetation, males investigated but did not charge blindly. They sniffed, listened, and often melted back into the interior. The default is caution, the exhilarated pylon is reserved for odds that have essentially gone to 0 for the other side. This is not mindless bloodlust, it is an ugly form of expected value calculation soaked into muscle memory. That mathematical temperament is why Ngogo blew up a long-running anthropological fight. For decades, some scholars argued that chimpanzee wars, like the notorious 4-year conflict at Gom, were artifacts of human interference, feeding stations, forest shrinkage, individual chimpanzees being pushed into closer proximity than they would ever choose on their own. Ngogo sits inside a protected park, with no provisioning, relatively intact habitat, and, if anything, a glut of calories. Yet it produced more documented intergroup killings than any other site on record. When Mike Wilson and colleagues stacked kill rates from multiple chimpanzee communities along a single axis, Ngogo landed at the high violence, low disturbance end, many adult males, frequent patrols, lots of lethal attacks, almost no direct human impact. The correlation that popped out was not more humans, more war, but more males and more opportunity, more war. That does not mean chimpanzees are automatons of murder. Even here, lethal raids are rare enough that individual attackers may participate in only a few over a lifetime. But it does force the arrow of causation to run from adaptive payoffs, more land, more fruit, more immigrants, better infant survival, to aggression, rather than the other way around. Meanwhile, the coalition machine was quietly soaring through its own frame. By the mid-2010s, Ngogo had swollen to roughly 200 chimpanzees, including perhaps 30-plus adult males. Daily party composition data showed a clear west-central spatial split. One cluster of individuals spent most of their time in the western half of the range, another in the central and eastern sectors. Grooming matrices and association indices confirmed what the GPS traces hinted at. These were not random subgroups, they were proto-communities with their own internal cores. Females, who make the ultimate decision about where to raise infants, also started to sort. Some west side females were almost never seen in the center except at massive fruiting trees. Hormone samples told their own story. Certain west males, including the aptly anxious Garrison, showed elevated glucocorticoid levels in periods of escalating tension, even before open conflict broke out. The cost of staying in one big crowd, queuing at feeding spots, jostling for mates under the eyes of dozens of competitors, managing an impossible number of relationships, was starting to outweigh the benefits of pooled defense. The formal split came into focus between 2015 and 2017. Field teams watched as Western parties stopped joining Central ones even at the choicest figs, as grooming between West and Central males dropped toward zero, and as what had been rough-and-tumble sparring began to look more like genuine hostility. When the first lethal attack by West males on a Central male was recorded in 2018, it shocked exactly nobody who had been reading the social network graphs. Yesterday's allies were now exactly the kind of isolated target that the Ngogo playbook had always exploited in neighbors. The cruelty was not in the method, that was the same. The cruelty was in the pronoun shift. A few years later, in 2022, a West patrol found Jackson, the aging former alpha of the Central community, on the fringes of his group's range and killed him. This was not an indiscriminate scramble, it looked like score settling against a male who had fought hard during the fission years. From a cold evolutionary standpoint, all of this is banal, contested males removed, competition thinned, borders clarified. From a cultural standpoint, it is a line being drawn through what had once been a single shared playbook. Today, instead of one super community, there are two daughter communities, Ngogo West and Ngogo Central. Each has on the order of 60 to 100 individuals, with something like 15 to 20 adult males apiece. Both hunt red colobus. Both patrol borders. Both still perform the hand-clasped grooming style that Ngogo made famous, raising arms overhead and lacing fingers with a partner's while the other hand works through fur. That continuity is important. It says the split was not a reset, it was a partition. At the same time, researchers are now listening obsessively for drift. There are hints that the two communities' panthoot calls are diverging, tiny differences in pitch contour or drumming accompaniment that might, over decades, become dialects. The tactics of numbers that used to be a single local specialty now exist in duplicate, potentially subject to different selection pressures if one community faces a tougher neighbor or a leaner patch of forest. Cultural evolution has been handed a natural experiment. Take one highly structured strategy, copy it into two social groups, and let demography and chance start to edit. The poignancy lives in the small collisions, not the big statistics. A male who grew up wrestling with a partner from the other side of the current border may now bristle and freeze when that familiar body appears in the distance, high-low erection rising, the same cues he would show to a total stranger. Mothers whose home ranges straddle the seam have to recalculate where they can safely feed with infants. Juveniles who spent their early years in parties that sometimes included West and Central adults now have to infer a new rule from grown-up behavior. Grooming is safe only on this side of the creek. That other call, which used to mean friends feeding over there, now means stay put. This is what group identity looks like when you can't explain it verbally. Hormones and scars impose categories. Borders get written into gut feelings and flight distances. The same brains that learned which buttress route to drum on and which vine mat will catch a fall are repurposed to track who counts as us and who does not. Into this quiet civil reconfiguration walked a film crew. The series that most people outside primatology know Ngogo from was shot in 2019 and 2020, just as the West and Central communities were settling into their separate identities. The production did what television must. It gave apes narrative arcs, lingering on charismatic adolescence, framing coalition politics as palace intrigue, and cutting the tedium of long, silent patrols into quick, tense sequences with swelling music. It was, by the standards of wildlife television, remarkably accurate. Viewers saw multi-male hunts with multiple kills. They saw patrols ghosting along borders, freezing at phantom cues, exploding into violence only when a victim could be isolated. They watched young males trying to insert themselves into serious coalitions and getting rebuffed, and they saw old warriors limping but still holding vital roles. What they could not see, because cameras are bad at this, was the ledger in the background, the accumulated hunts and patrols, the history of who had shared meat with whom, the faint divergence of panthoots between West and Central. For that you need spreadsheets, hormone assays, and a willingness to be bored in the forest. The show gave Ngogo a global audience. The notebooks kept track of why anything on screen made sense. If there is a thread that runs through all of this, it is that Ngogo's brilliance is not some mysterious spark. It is the sum of thousands of small, correct decisions, where a foot lands, when a youngster is allowed to tag along, who gets a scrap of meat, when a buttress is hammered or left alone. The culture that turns those decisions into habits is fragile. A respiratory virus from a careless human, a run of snares along the park edge, a few key veterans lost at the wrong time, any of those could snap links in the chain. But as long as fig trees keep fruiting, border ridges keep holding, and adolescent chimps keep watching elders with the intense, slightly obnoxious stare of teenagers everywhere, the tactics of numbers will keep being learned and relearned, one bruised sternum and one corrected drum solo at a time. From ground level, none of this looks like numbers. It looks like a damp Ugandan morning in Kibale, mist sitting in the valleys, one research assistant in rubber boots trying not to swear as he follows 30 kilograms of adolescent chimp down a slope that feels designed by a liability lawyer. The chimp, maybe 10 years old, is doing what tourists think chimps always do, swinging, pausing to eat figs, occasionally wrestling a peer, but the assistant's notebook turns that chaos into coordinates: party size 18, sex ratio heavily male, direction southeast toward a known colobus patch, wind moving upslope at about 2 kilometers an hour. From the forest floor you can't see the whole fission fusion machine, you just see this fragment, a line of males spreading slightly as they approach a low saddle, shoulders tilting, vocalizers going quiet. The difference between a nice hike with apes and you are now walking behind an armed patrol is about 5 decibels and a few meters of spacing, and on their first week at Ngogo even graduate students miss it. The chimps don't. They treat the humans as mobile shrubs that sometimes click pens, and they move around them with the same precision they move around buttress roots and thorn vines. That choreography is the informal curriculum you only pick up when your job is to be the shrub. The public interface to Ngogo now arrives mostly through screens. When a documentary crew finally got permission to follow the community full-time in the late 2010s, they did what they had to do for television: pick a handful of charismatic males, give them short, pronounceable names, and cut months of patrols and hunts into 4 episodes where every coalition has a plot arc. On camera, it looks as if a few bold individuals are constantly making dramatic decisions: to hunt, to charge, to betray. Off camera, on days when no boom mic is handy, you get more realistic ratios: 4 or 5 patrols a week when male numbers and fruit allow it, plenty of dry runs that end in nothing more cinematic than a slow U-turn at a ridge, and hunts that begin not with a heroic shout but with an adult male slipping sideways into a low canopy patch and giving a single, quiet, where, that only nearby males seem to hear. The crews are good at catching the theater: kills, fights, reconciliations. What you don't see in the final cut are the 90-minute stretches where the most interesting thing that happens is a flank male stopping for 3 extra seconds to smell a vine he remembers from the last time someone screamed there. If you are lucky enough to visit Kibale as a tourist, you won't be taken to Ngogo. You'll walk shorter loops with better-behaved chimps at Kanyawara or another habituated community where party sizes are closer to what field textbooks promise: maybe 8 or 10 individuals, not 40. The guides will explain dominance hierarchies and show you grooming clusters, and the big thrill is often a short pant-hoot chorus or a glimpse of a monkey hunt that starts and ends before you can focus your binoculars. From those trails, it is easy to believe chimp life is mostly feeding and occasional soap opera drama. Ngogo is what happens when you scale the same species up by a factor of 2 or 3 in both numbers and male density and then let it run for decades. The park keeps that circus for science and for the chimps, not for day tickets, and so most people's mental picture of chimp behavior is based on smaller, less explosive communities. It's a little like trying to infer everything about a city from a village, useful, but you'll miss what happens when you have rush hour and riots. Learning to see better at Ngogo starts with unlearning where to look. Newcomers stare at faces, veterans watch hips and shoulders. A head can point anywhere, a pelvis only points where the animal is seriously thinking of going. On a quiet border patrol, the lead male's head may swing left and right, sniffing, while his hips stay aligned with a particular gully. The second and third males keep their pelvic axes staggered, not because they've read a manual but because 15 years of practice taught them that overlapping paths mean tripping, and tripping means noise, and noise means your target hears you before you smell him. Field assistants count spacing in strides. If the gap between males shrinks below 1 body length in dense undergrowth, everyone knows an encounter is more likely. Chimps close ranks when they expect trouble. You can walk the same line for a month before your brain starts noticing that compression 10 seconds before a distant branch crack, and once you've seen it you can't unsee it. The chimps are doing Bayesian updating with muscle memory, the humans are playing catch-up with clipboards. The comedy, which is considerable, lives in the mismatch between what the apes are doing and what the humans think they're doing. Take meat sharing. On paper, Ngogo's meat transfers look almost boring. Hunts succeed in well over 80% of colobus attempts. Multiple monkeys are often killed in a single campaign, and post-hunt logs show that carcass holders hand over strips of flesh to beggars without much overt aggression. In the field, it plays like a mix of religious ritual and student cafeteria. A high-ranking male with an entire hindquarter will sit down, brace his feet, and begin to peel strips while a semicircle of beggars crouches at a respectful distance, hands extended, emitting thin, high whimpers that sound exactly like a squeaky hinge being slowly murdered. The rules are clear. Don't touch the main piece without an invitation, don't whimper directly into the owner's ear unless you are an infant or have a very strong lawyer. Occasionally a junior misjudges and reaches too far. The correction is instantaneous, a cuff, a bark, and, more devastatingly, being ignored on the next 2 or 3 handouts. Sharing here is not sentimental, it's a live reputation system. The funny part is that to a new observer it looks as if the most dramatic thing is the slap. The real action is in the mental spreadsheet each male is updating with every bite. You shared with me today, I will remember you when I need you tomorrow. Juveniles supply the slapstick that keeps everyone honest. Ngogo is full of teenage males who have watched 1,000 hunts and think they understand them perfectly until the forest offers a pop quiz. One common blooper goes like this: a young male, amped on colobus alarm calls, sprints ahead of the drivers and attempts to block a predicted escape route, only to misjudge the elasticity of a liana and rebound into his own teammates like a furry bowling ball. The monkeys sail overhead, using exactly the branch he just vacated. Nobody dies, everyone learns. Scrapes and bruises from these misfires show up in the long-term health records as transient swelling or minor infections, not catastrophic injuries, and yet they are a crucial tuition payment. The veterans do not intervene unless the mistake risks serious harm. Letting a youngster make a fool of himself in front of friends is apparently part of the training package. Field assistants, who have similar bruises from tripping over the same routes, are sympathetic right up until the moment the juvenile, now a few seasons older, nails the block perfectly and then swaggers at the carcass as if he invented geometry. Even the famous violence has moments of absurdity when you watch it in real time instead of as a highlight reel. Intergroup encounters are, on average, rare. Dozens of patrol hours may pass with no contact at all, and when they do happen they often begin with a confused chorus, distant pant hoots that might be neighbors, might be your own males rebounding off a valley wall. On one recorded morning in the early 2000s, Ngogo males followed an unfamiliar call toward the northeastern border only to discover, at close range, that the noise came from a pair of young males from the neighbor group rehearsing an adult-style display at entirely the wrong volume. The response was not the catastrophic ambush you might expect from the statistics, it was a brief, furious chase, a lot of crashing vegetation, and then a drawn-out inspection of the saplings the youngsters had been beating. The eventual lethal encounters that defined Ngogo's expansion campaign happened elsewhere and otherwise, under conditions of overwhelming numerical advantage. This kind of dud, nobody, just a scared teenager and two bent saplings, floats around camp as a story precisely because it didn't end up in a paper. It is a reminder that the same tactical machinery that produces killings also produces false alarms, rehearsals, and, occasionally, mercy by confusion. If you want a crash course in seeing better without a field season, you can do worse than learning how the Ugandan field assistants narrate a day. Their radio calls are compressed ethnography. A morning report might be, Wilson with 12 at Big Ficus, heading to Old Logging Road, many where calls, which, translated, means, a well-connected adult male is moving a mid-sized party toward a known patrol corridor, vocalizing just enough to recruit but not enough to advertise to neighbors. Another report, females and infants alone at Camp Valley, males gone, nowhere, tells you that a patrol is probably underway elsewhere and that the interior is effectively under babysitter rule. Over months, those short phrases build a mental map, which groves attract big fusions, which saddles are favored for quiet crossings, which borders feel hot, based on how often you hear sudden silence on the radio. Visitors who parachute in for a few weeks tend to remember the screams, the people who walk the same loops for 20 years remember the absences, the days when a ridge that should ring with drumming at dawn is mysteriously quiet. The forest around Ngogo had its own low-resolution legend long before any of this was written down. In the 1970s, when Kibale was still a forest reserve with logging concessions running along some edges, forestry staff and local villagers already talked about a patch near Ngogo where 40 or more chimpanzees drummed and screamed in the trees, a number so high it read as exaggeration in reports. Those early accounts mentioned tree drums, loud, resonant booms when chimps stamped on buttress roots or smashed fallen logs, and described nights when humans camping nearby could not sleep because of what sounded like a riot overhead. No one then had individual IDs or GPS coordinates, just the impression of an unusually large, unusually noisy community. When Wrangham's surveys in the 1980s and Maitani and Watt's team in the mid-1990s finally did the boring work of nest counts and photographic ID, the numbers caught up with the legend. A community over 100 strong by the late 1990s, with more than 20 adult males. And a home range far larger than Kanyawara's. The forestry stories turned out not to be fishermen's tales after all. They were the first blurry sightings of the same supersized society the papers now quantify to the decimal. Inside the project, lore accumulates at a finer grain. One patch of old road where males repeatedly launched successful ambushes on red colobus earns a nickname in camp, the funnel, and suddenly you can refer to an entire strategy with a single word at dinner. Another spot, a shallow valley where patrols have repeatedly turned back when wind shifted, becomes Coward's Dip, unfair to the chimps but very efficient as a warning. If the line stalls there, everyone's hair stands up. None of those labels appear in journals, but they matter because they are how humans remember where knowledge lives. When a long-serving field assistant leaves or a veteran male dies, the toponyms lose a little resolution. The new crew knows the GPS coordinate, but not the story of the day an overconfident patrol pushed 10 meters past Coward's Dip and met 3 neighbors braced behind a log. The chimpanzees, who do not use English but do remember the log, update their own mental overlay. Sometimes they now stop 20 meters earlier. That adjustment never hits a graph, it lives in the color of their hesitation. Some of the most persistent stories orbit individuals whose names never make it into formal tables. The intra-community killing in 2004 of a young adult male nicknamed SBD, a rare case where Ngogo males turned their coalition inward, left a stain on both the social network and the camp mythology. For years afterwards, people referred to the clearing where it happened as SBD's place, and any time a big male coalition started to form there, assistants would mutter that name into their recorders almost as a spell. The chimps had their own version. After that event, low-ranking males were noticeably more cautious about inserting themselves into dominance disputes near that site, approaching with more piloerection, more distance, more glances at allies. The law and the behavior line up, a memory of a rare, costly turn of the coalition machinery inward, encoded in both human gossip and primate body language. You can watch cultural memory in real time when a juvenile born years later hesitates at SBD's place, pulled back by the tension in older males' shoulders rather than by any personal experience. Even the recent fission of the community, when West and Central peeled apart between about 2015 and 2019, has already grown a layer of folk narrative on top of the raw graphs. On paper, the split shows up as association indices dropping between particular males, grooming matrices fragmenting into 2 clusters, and party composition tables that suddenly stop mixing certain names. In camp, People talk instead about the year the forest learned two accents. Field assistants began marking parties on the radio as West-like or Central-like before anyone officially declared two communities. They felt the split before they modeled it, because their days were full of small anomalies. Males who once tolerated each other at big ficus began avoiding eye contact. Females with long friendships found themselves harassed when they crossed an invisible line. Patrols that used to relax at certain borders began to show the tight, quiet spacing usually reserved for true outsiders. When the first lethal post-fission attacks happened, the numbers were ugly but unsurprising. The legend that formed afterward, yesterday's hunting partner is today's enemy, is melodramatic, but it matches the constraint the data highlight. Loyalty in chimpanzees is bounded sharply by community identity, and when that identity fractures, cultural knowledge about patrols and raids quickly gets reproposed against former friends. For all of this, the easiest way to misread Ngogo is to focus only on the loud moments. The quiet days are where most of the cultural work gets done. A patrol that sets out at dawn, walks for 4 hours without meeting anyone, and comes home with no blood and no meat looks like nothing happened if your metric is spectacle. If your metric is information, that morning was a survey. 12 males confirmed that a set of ridges was clear of neighbors, that certain fruit trees on the fringe were still unclaimed, that a recently contested creek crossing now smells only of their own group. Those data feed into future patrol decisions and into the confidence with which mothers take their infants to feed near the border that afternoon. The same goes for hunts that fail early because the lead males decide, after a few minutes of canopy inspection, that the structure is wrong, too many escape vines, too few deadfall bridges, and abort with no chase. On film, that's dead air. In a notebook, it's evidence that chimps are applying a learned template for worth the risk rather than charging at every monkey silhouette. If you ever find yourself listening to Ngogo through a hydrophone of data rather than a camera, the trick is to borrow the field team's patience and the chimp's attention to small variables. When you watch footage of a hunt, don't just count how many males are present, track who moves first, who moves sideways, who hangs back with a juvenile and thus loses meat now but may gain a grateful ally later. When you read that the community killed 13 neighbors over a decade and expanded its territory by about 22%, remember that those numbers sit on top of hundreds of patrols in which the most dramatic event was a male sniffing a sapling and deciding to turn around. The culture of tactics at Ngogo is not just in the big, bloody outcomes, it is in the accretion of these tiny, repeated decisions that no documentary will ever have time to show. The chimps teach each other, not with lectures, not with demonstrations, but with bodies arranged in space, again and again, until the youngsters stop needing to look up to know which way to go at the next fork. The humans, if they're doing it right, are just close enough to write it down and just far enough not to matter. The joke only lands because the rest of the system isn't funny at all. A community that can turn Red Colobus into a conveyor belt of meat and outsiders into statistics also has to live with what that competence costs when it turns inward. The fission at Ngogo, West peeling away from Central in the mid-2010s, didn't start with a dramatic speech, it started with absences on grooming logs. Males who had spent their teens side by side at fig trees simply stopped showing up in each other's day lists. By 2015 the Western sub-community was running its own parties of roughly 60 chimps with around 18 adult males, rarely fusing with the larger Central East mass of about 120 individuals. Researchers reluctantly began coding West and Central as if they were separate communities, then watched reality catch up with the spreadsheet. The first lethal attack after the breakup made it obvious that the pronouns had changed. In June 2018, a group of West males caught a young Central adult male, nicknamed PJ by the team, lagging at the edge of his party and beat him to death over more than 10 minutes. No one intervened, the observers stayed back because that is the rule, and the rest of PJ's party fled rather than die beside him because that is the rule, too. West males who had groomed him as adolescents delivered the injuries. Their motivation in the papers reads as resource competition, numerical advantage, imbalance of power strategy, all accurate and none of which help when you look at the photographs of his mother the next week. If you think that's the emotional bottom, the forest disagrees. In December 2019, West males launched a more spectacular raid on a Central male named Miles, one of the old community's senior heavyweights who had stayed with Central when the split came. They ambushed him at an overlap zone, dragged him down, and beat him for roughly 20 minutes, inflicting injuries so severe he died soon after. For once, females joined the main assault. West females targeted Central females who tried to defend Miles, turning what could have been written off as a purely male war into something closer to a neighborhood purge. The field notes from that day are clinical, timestamps, individual IDs, description of wounds, And then, at the bottom, a sentence about observers going back to camp in silence. Any story you tell about Ngogo as gangsters of the forest has to sit next to that scene. A third act followed in 2022, when Ngogo West males crossed back into Central's core and killed Jackson, the Central Alpha. Jackson wasn't a stranger. He had been a major player in the politics around the original split and a familiar presence at West's Figs years earlier. When West caught him slightly separated from his supporters, they treated him exactly like they had treated anonymous northeastern neighbors a decade before: overwhelming force, bite patterns that look like the textbook on coalitionary killing, no injuries to attackers. From an evolutionary standpoint, the move makes ugly sense. Remove a forceful rival male from the board, open space in the hierarchy, reduce the chance that Central will recover enough male strength to pose a serious threat. From a cultural standpoint, it underlines the lecture's thesis: tactics learned at outsiders are reusable on yesterday's insiders with zero firmware update. There are softer tragedies that never appear in graphs. A high-ranking male can die in a raid and his name will appear in a table headed "Victims," neatly tied to a territory gain or a shift in patrol behavior. The infant who climbs onto his dead body and stays there until nightfall is not in that table. The adolescent who grew up trailing that male on patrols and now has no obvious elder to walk behind is not in that table either. He's just the nervous body you see 2 years later hesitating at a ridge he used to cross confidently. Ngogo has produced more than 20 documented intergroup killings, the majority of them by its own males. Every one of those entries in the Maitani Watts Amsler ledger implies a set of orphans whose apprenticeship now has a hole in it, and a set of juveniles who have to relearn the geometry of a border from scratch. That's the part of culture that field sites make you stare at. When a teacher dies, a place forgets, and forgetting is dangerous. So why pay this much attention to one murderous postcode? Because Ngogo has been the experiment nature reluctantly ran for us. For decades there was a comfortable story available. Chimpanzee wars, especially the famous 4-year conflict at Gom, were artifacts of human meddling, provisioned bananas, shrinking forests, cameras too close. If that story were right, then a large, well-fed, unprovisioned community in a robust Ugandan park should have been peaceful. Instead, Ngogo delivered the opposite: the highest recorded male count, the highest documented rate of lethal intergroup attacks, and a decade-long campaign in which at least 13 neighbors died and the killers walked away uninjured, having added about 6.4 square kilometers, roughly a 22% increase, to their home range. When Wilson and colleagues finally put kill rates from sites across Africa on one axis in 2014, Ngogo sat at the bloody end without any help from humans beyond the act of watching. What Ngogo gives you, uncomfortably, is a clean demonstration that coalitionary killing can pay in the currencies evolution actually cares about. After the northeastern neighbor was extinguished, fruit availability inside Ngogo's range improved. Females immigrated into the enlarged, safe territory. Infant survival climbed in a forest with fewer raiding neighbors to grab babies at the margin. Patrol participation, when tracked over 20 years, correlated not just with today's stress hormone levels or tomorrow's limp, but with long-term reproductive payoff. Males who patrolled more ended up with more surviving offspring, even when they started out with no infants to defend. That is group augmentation written in apes. Risk your skin for the coalition now, because an expanded, well-fed community will eventually give even mid-rankers a shot at paternity. At the same time, Ngogo has dismantled another lazy story, that cooperation in animals is always a thinly disguised kinship algorithm. Yes, maternal brothers there are tightly bonded. Genetic analysis of fecal DNA shows that brothers groom, share meat, and form coalitions at higher rates than unrelated males. But the alliance map is not a family tree. Non-kin pairs and triads also invest heavily in grooming, support one another in fights, and share meat reciprocally over spans of years. Social network analyses that calculate eigen vector centrality, the importance of a node based on the importance of its allies, show that some of the most influential males sit in the middle of mixed kin cliques, not tidy brotherhoods. Ngogo's culture of coalition is, in other words, a mutual aid pact built from both blood and long memory of favors delivered. This is why the meat matters. Before Ngogo, meat for sex was the catchy idea. Males supposedly traded cuts of carcass to estrus females for copulations. With detailed logs of 70-plus hunts and relentless codings of who got what and who mated when, Maitani and Watts could finally do the boring but necessary regression. The result: females rarely got meat in the first place, and males who shared with them did not enjoy more mating access. What did predict sharing was male-male relationship strength and future coalition support. A male at Ngogo who gets a favored seat at carcasses isn't being rewarded for his looks. He's either being paid back for past help or being courted as future backup in a fight. Meat is currency for alliances in a community where you need allies just to survive patrol duty. Culture here is not only about where bodies stand in a hunt, it's about how calories are redirected to cement the knowledge holders to one another. The stakes are ecological as well as social. The same hunting proficiency that makes Ngogo such a useful model system for cooperation turns it into a significant predator of its immediate neighborhood. Red colobus in the Ngogo sector live under a level of primate predation that would make a deer biologist faint. Estimates put annual mortality from chimpanzee hunting at 6 to 12% of the local colobus population, with Ngogo hunters routinely taking multiple individuals in a single event and succeeding in over 80% of their attempts. Long-term counts show red colobus numbers declining in the core Ngogo range relative to less heavily hunted sectors, and there are hints that surviving groups shift their ranging and aggregation patterns to minimize time in low, broken canopy where chimps' tactics bite hardest. Chimp culture here isn't just a social phenomenon, it is a pressure on someone else's demography. From a conservation standpoint, that raises awkward but vital questions. If you protect Ngogo only in the simplistic sense of keeping the chimps alive, you might accidentally engineer a system where a culturally hypercompetent predator overharvests a preferred prey. But the real conservation object isn't a single species, it's a network of interacting knowledge systems. Red colobus troops have their own learned routines, their own decisions about where to sleep, when to travel, which alarm calls to heed, and those may be evolving under Ngogo's assault right now. Losing Ngogo's coalition grammar would simplify the forest in a way that feels morally comforting but biologically dishonest. Protecting it means accepting that some colobus will die in horrifying ways because they live under an ape society that has discovered the math of overwhelming force. And then there is the conspicuously hairless primate standing 10 meters back with a notebook. Ngogo is not a pristine system free of Homo sapiens, it is precisely the opposite, a place where humans have been moving with the chimps almost daily for 3 decades. The ethical rules are rigid: no feeding, no touching, 7-meter minimum distance tightened during outbreaks, masks when respiratory disease anywhere in the region raises alarms, boot disinfection at dawn. When a juvenile caught in a poacher's wire snare needed help, vets were called in and the wire was cut because that was an injury clearly caused by humans. When a patrol catches a neighbor and dismantles him, nobody reaches for a dart gun. That would change the behavior we came to understand and would implicitly declare chimpanzee war a special case where we override, let nature take its course. The project lives in that contradiction. We are there to protect chimps from us, not from each other, and that means watching events that would get you tried in The Hague if the actors wore uniforms. This is where the why it matters part picks up a mirror and hands it back. Wrangham's imbalance of power hypothesis and later multi-site analyses had already suggested that chimpanzees, like humans in small-scale societies, exploit numerical advantage to wage low-risk, high-payoff war. Ngogo supplied the hard case where the usual excuses, habitat loss, provisioning, tourist harassment, simply did not apply. The techniques you see here, silent patrols, opportunistic attacks on isolated individuals, slow annexation of territory, group-level benefits accruing over decades, are recognizable enough that archaeologists and anthropologists now cite Ngogo when they talk about how ancestral humans might have cleared neighboring valleys. You can't walk away from this forest and say, violence is the bit that culture will lift us out of. Violence is one of the things culture is exceptionally good at optimizing when the payoffs line up. But if Ngogo is a grim model of what coalition knowledge can do under one set of incentives, it's also a warning about limits. Community size they're pushed into the 150 to 200 range, flirting with the same rough ceiling that Robin Dunbar's argument about primate neocortex and social networks predicts for humans. For a while, that massive social graph held, sub-neighborhoods formed, males managed their alliances, the community acted as one when an outsider appeared. Once the external enemy disappeared and internal competition for mates and food rose, the glue began to fail. Fission is what happens when the culture that let you conquer the neighborhood stops paying inside the walls. In that sense, Ngogo shows us not just how far cooperation can scale but where it cracks, and how quickly former allies can reclassify one another when the edges of us and them get redrawn. So is this culture stable, or are we catching it at a hinge point? On some axes, continuity is winning. Both Ngogo West and Ngogo Central still practice the same classic Ngogo behaviors: hand-clasped grooming, intricate male coalitions, high hunting rates, silent patrols. Infant production in both daughter communities has been healthy in recent years, with on the order of 8 to 10 new infants per side in 2021, suggesting that whatever stress fission brought, it did not crash female reproduction. On other axes, drift is probably already underway. Acoustic work is picking apart panthoot structures, listening for subtle differences in phrasing between West and Central that may become fully fledged dialects, as cohorts grow up hearing only their own community's version of the chorus. If war tactics and greeting calls diverge in parallel, Ngogo will have given us not just a snapshot of culture but a time-lapse of how one community's shared knowledge buds into two slightly different traditions. The background risks are the boring ones with teeth. Kibale National Park still covers about 776 square kilometers of mid-altitude forest, but human density around its edges is high, and farmland and bushmeat snares press the boundary in ways no chimp understands until a hand is gone. Respiratory disease has already brushed Ngogo more than once, each time triggering new layers of hygiene protocol. A pathogen with Ebola-level lethality for apes crossing that 7-meter gap would not care about our sample sizes. Climate change threatens to stretch the lean seasons, stress fig phenology, and turn the steady food supply that underwrote Ngogo's supercommunity into a more erratic ration. A culture that evolved under fat years may behave very differently if colobus are fewer and fruit more patchy. None of these threats target culture directly, they target bodies. But culture is stored in bodies, so any hit to adult survival among the experienced males is a hit to the curriculum. The one thing Ngogo probably doesn't have to fear, at least in the short term, is indifference. In 2023 a 4-part Netflix series dropped millions of people into Kibale's canopy, with drones and long lenses stitching patrols and hunts into a crime saga. The editing anthropomorphized shamelessly, the physics and relationships, though, tracked field notes uncomfortably well. Viewers met old males like Wilson and Miles as characters instead of data points and were, for a few weeks, more emotionally invested in patrol outcomes in Uganda than in most policy debates at home. Researchers can roll their eyes at some of the narration and still welcome the consequence: more attention, more funding, more political pressure to keep Kibale a park rather than a logging concession with a chimp logo. If the price of protecting a culture of apes is that they occasionally get cast as gang leaders in prestige TV, you swallow your aesthetic objections and cash the conservation benefit. Walk the Ngogo trails in a dry season and it becomes obvious what, exactly, we are being asked to protect. It isn't chimpanzees, in the abstract, it's specific threads of practice. A young male learning how close he can follow a patrol leader without snapping a twig that will get him hissed at. A mid-ranker deciding, at a carcass, whether to send a small piece of meat to a potential ally or to a current one. An old female choosing a sleeping tree that balances fruit access against the probability her infant will be in the path of a patrol's fallout tomorrow. These decisions are where culture lives, in where feet fall, which hand extends, when a body decides to run or to stay. The fact that we can write any of this down is a side effect of 30 years of people dragging notebooks and GPS units through mud. The fact that it exists at all is a side effect of millions of years of evolution discovering that information, once learned, is too valuable to keep trapped in one skull. By the time the forest quiets in the evening and the last patrol straggles home, what remains is not a story about evil apes or noble conservation icons. It's something more disconcerting and more useful, a living example of how knowledge can turn numbers into tactics, tactics into territory, and territory back into the survival of infants that will one day learn to walk these same ridges. Ngogo's chimps are not rehearsing to become us or redeem us, they are busy being what they are, highly social, occasionally terrifying African apes running a culture that works for them in a particular patch of forest. If we do our job, we keep the forest intact and the classrooms open. After that, the lesson is theirs to keep writing, one quiet footstep at a time.